Nobody tells you this part. After the Sophia stage, clarity has a cost. Not because you become cynical, not because you stop loving people, but because you start seeing what love can't fix. You notice the manipulation before it becomes a fight. You notice the resentment before it becomes a betrayal. You notice the performance before it becomes a promise. And once you notice it, your body refuses to pretend. Jung described this as a dangerous kind of consciousness. Not dangerous because it's wrong, but because it makes social survival harder. You become a mirror. And most people don't hate mirrors. They hate what mirrors reveal. So if you've been feeling like you don't belong lately, it might not be depression. It might be differentiation. And the real question is, what do you do when you can't ignore it anymore? Nobody tells you what happens next. It's not that you start speaking more. It's that you start speaking less. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you're no longer negotiating what you already know. Before this stage, you adjusted constantly. You softened your tone. You reframed the obvious. You carried emotional weight that wasn't yours, and you called it maturity. But after the Sophia stage, something in your nervous system recalibrates. You still perceive the tension. You still see the inconsistency, but your body no longer rushes to repair it. And that shift, subtle as it is, changes the entire social dynamic. Because groups rely on unconscious stabilizers. There is always someone who smooths the edges, someone who absorbs discomfort, someone who keeps the peace. Often, that was you. And when you stop doing it, the room doesn't relax. It destabilizes. Jung described this as the withdrawal of unconscious participation. When consciousness differentiates, it no longer merges automatically with collective denial. And that's when the isolation begins. Not because you attacked anyone, but because you stopped protecting the illusion. When you stop participating unconsciously, people don't always notice what changed, but they feel what you're no longer doing. You're no longer cushioning conversations. You're no longer translating immaturity into empathy. You're no longer rescuing fragile egos from reality. And because you've done that for so long, the room had adapted to your role. Most groups have an unconscious stabilizer, someone who smooths the edges, someone who absorbs discomfort, someone who keeps the peace without realizing it. Often, that was you. So when you stop, the atmosphere doesn't simply stay neutral. It shifts, not into chaos, into unease. You may notice people explaining themselves around you more, or avoiding certain topics, or joking a little too quickly, or suddenly calling you distant. This is the first danger after the Sophia stage. Not loneliness, displacement. You begin to feel slightly out of rhythm with the collective mood. Not because you think you're above it, not because you stopped caring, but because you can now hear two conversations at once. The spoken one, and the emotional one underneath it. And once you hear the undercurrent, laughing at the surface can feel like betrayal of your own awareness. So you become quieter, not as punishment, as honesty. Jung described this as the withdrawal of unconscious participation, the moment consciousness differentiates and no longer merges automatically with the emotional field of the group. Before this threshold, you belonged by blending. After it, you belong differently. And most people don't know how to handle that. Because when you stop stabilizing the illusion starts looking for a reason. Illusions don't blame themselves. They look for a face. Very often, yours. At first, it's subtle. You notice a change in tone, a slight defensiveness, a comment that feels sharper than necessary. You didn't accuse anyone. You didn't expose anything. You didn't confront. You simply stopped compensating. And that alone shifts the dynamic. This is where Jung becomes essential to understand. He observed that when an individual differentiates psychologically, they begin to function as a mirror. Not intentionally, structurally, the clearer you become, the less you distort what you see. And when someone encounters their own denied qualities reflected back at them, the unconscious reacts, not with gratitude, with defense. Jung called this shadow projection. Everything a person refuses to acknowledge in themselves searches for an external target, and the most available target is often the one who stopped participating in denial. This is why, after the Sophia stage, you may notice something confusing. You feel calmer inside, but more misunderstood outside. You say less, but are interpreted more. You withdraw from drama, and are accused of being cold. The psyche of the group senses that something has shifted. Before, you absorbed tension. Now, you return it, and returned tension feels like attack. To someone who relied on you to carry it. This is not about superiority. It's about structure. Before the Sophia stage, you were fused. After it, you are differentiated. Fusion stabilizes groups. Differentiation destabilizes them. And destabilization activates projection. But here is the part most people don't expect. The real danger is not that others project onto you. It's what you might do next because of it. If you're wondering whether this shift is happening to you, there are patterns, not dramatic ones, subtle reorganizations, and they don't feel like awakening. They feel like dissonance. Sign 1, you feel less reactive, but more observant. Situations that once pulled you in emotionally, now register differently. You still see the manipulation. You still feel the tension. But instead of entering it automatically, you pause. And that pause feels foreign, almost unnatural at first. Because your old identity was built around response. Now your nervous system doesn't rush forward. It assesses. That assessment can feel like distance, but it's actually differentiation. Sign 2. You no longer feel responsible for emotional equilibrium. Before, if someone was upset, you stabilized it. If someone was uncomfortable, you softened it. If something felt off, you adjusted yourself to correct it. Now you notice something radical. You see the imbalance, and you don't move to fix it. Not because you don't care, but because you no longer believe it's yours to carry. That shift can feel selfish. It isn't. It's boundary formation. Sign 3. Certain conversations feel physically exhausting. You begin noticing that laughter feels heavier than silence. Not because they are intense, because they are misaligned. You sit in discussions where the emotional undercurrent contradicts the spoken words. And instead of translating the tension into comfort like you used to, you feel your body resisting the performance. The laughter feels heavier. The silence feels louder. Sometimes silence feels more honest than participation. You're no longer able to unsee the pattern. And unseeing used to be your survival mechanism. Sign 4. You are less interested in being understood. This one surprises people. Before, you explained yourself carefully. You clarified. You reassured. Now, you notice a quiet shift. If someone misinterprets you, you don't rush to correct it. Not because you don't value connection, but because you no longer need to control perception to feel safe. That internal security often looks like indifference from the outside. It isn't indifference. It's consolidation. Sign 5. You feel alone, even in familiar environments. Not abandoned. Not rejected. Just slightly out of sync. The group still functions, but you are aware of layers they are not acknowledging. And participating in those unspoken agreements feels dishonest now. This is not superiority. It's structural difference. And structural difference feels like loneliness before it feels like clarity. If you recognize these signs, you are not regressing. You are crossing something. But here's the part most people don't talk about. If you misinterpret this stage, you can harden instead of integrate. And that is where the real danger begins. After the Sophia stage, the loneliness doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't look like rejection. It feels quieter than that. It feels like sitting in a familiar room and realizing you are no longer synchronized with its rhythm. The people are the same. The conversations are the same. The dynamics haven't changed. But you have. And the shift is subtle enough that no one else names it. You still care. You still love. You still show up. But internally, something has reorganized. You're no longer scanning the room for who needs regulation. You're no longer adjusting your tone to preserve comfort. You're no longer absorbing tension as a way of belonging. And without those unconscious movements, you feel slightly separate. Not above, not outside, just distinct. You begin noticing how much of social connection relied on shared illusion, shared simplification, shared avoidance. Before this stage, you participated in those simplifications. Now your nervous system resists it, and resisting it feels like distance. Sometimes you sit in a conversation, and you can feel two realities at once, the surface dialogue and the unspoken undercurrent. And for the first time, you don't feel responsible for translating one into the other. You simply observe both. That observation creates space, and space creates silence. And silence, in groups that function through emotional fusion, can feel threatening. You may notice something strange. People who once felt close now feel slightly guarded, not hostile, just careful, as if your quiet clarity is louder than your old empathy. And here is the part that confuses most people. You don't feel sad. You feel awake. But awakening doesn't automatically come with belonging. It comes with separation first. Jung described individuation as a withdrawal from collective unconscious participation. But he also warned, withdrawal without integration can become isolation. And this is the threshold. Because at this point, you have two options. You can contract, or you can stabilize. And many people, without realizing it, begin to contract. Not aggressively, not consciously, but subtly. And that subtle contraction is what turns clarity into hardness. There is a moment no one talks about. It happens quietly, after you feel the separation, after you notice the displacement, after you sense that something in you has changed. You consider going back, not consciously, but subtly. You think, maybe I'm being too rigid. Maybe I'm misreading things. Maybe it was easier before. You remember how fluid you used to be, how easily you blended, how naturally you stabilized the room. You didn't feel this distance then. You didn't feel this internal friction. And for a brief moment, fusion starts to look like connection again. You wonder if clarity is worth the cost. If maybe belonging requires softening your edges once more. This is the most vulnerable part of the Sophia stage. Not projection. Not misunderstanding. Temptation. The temptation to collapse your awareness. To regain comfort. Because fusion is comfortable. It removes tension. It removes the burden of standing alone in perception. It gives you immediate harmony. But it costs you yourself. Before differentiation, you were loved for how well you adapted. After differentiation, you are respected, but less needed. And being needed feels safer than being respected. So the psyche whispers, maybe I should just ease up. Maybe I should go back to translating the room. Maybe it wasn't that heavy after all. But it was heavy. You were just used to carrying it. And what feels like loneliness now is actually the absence of overfunctioning. That absence feels empty at first. Because you built identity around being the emotional regulator, the mediator, the interpreter. Without that role, you feel undefined, and undefined can feel like loss. This is where many people retreat. They soften their perception again. They laugh at what they see. They absorb tension again. They over-explain again. And the system stabilizes. But they fragment. The tragedy isn't that people reject your clarity. It's that you reject it yourself to stay included. Jung warned that individuation requires the courage to withstand temporary isolation, not permanent exile, temporary misalignment. Because if you collapse awareness to regain comfort, you reset the entire process, and the psyche will bring you back here again, only louder. This stage tests one thing. Will you trade authenticity for immediate harmony, or will you tolerate discomfort long enough for a new equilibrium to form? Because a new equilibrium does form, but it requires endurance, and endurance feels like loneliness before it feels like alignment. And if that temptation isn't recognized, the contraction doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like anger. It feels like efficiency. You begin conserving your energy. You stop explaining yourself. You stop offering emotional labor that isn't reciprocated. You stop engaging in conversations that feel performative. And all of that is healthy, at first. But something subtle can begin to happen beneath that health. You start preferring distance. Not because people are dangerous, but because clarity is exhausting when it isn't shared. You tell yourself you're simply protecting your peace. And sometimes you are. But sometimes, you are withdrawing before connection has a chance to stabilize at a higher level. This is where Jung's warning becomes relevant. Individuation is not withdrawal from humanity. It is differentiation within relationship. If differentiation turns into detachment, the psyche hardens. Not dramatically, quietly. You become less available, less responsive, less invested. You convince yourself that you don't need resonance, that self-sufficiency is enough. But human consciousness does not individuate in isolation. It individuates through tension, through friction, through encounter. If the Sophia stage becomes a justification for disengagement, it stops being integration. It becomes armor, and armor feels powerful, until it becomes lonely. This is the danger most people don't talk about. Not projection, not misunderstanding. Hardness, the quiet decision that says, if they can't see what I see, I'll simply step back. And stepping back repeatedly can turn into disappearance. Jung emphasized that the superior function must be integrated, not idolized. If you begin to identify with your clarity, instead of relating through it, you create a new imbalance. Before, you were fused. Now, you risk becoming rigid, and rigidity feels like strength. But it's just another form of unconscious reaction. So the real question after the Sophia stage is not, why don't I fit anymore? It's, how do I remain open without dissolving again? The challenge after the Sophia stage is not learning to see. You already see. The challenge is learning how to remain open, without returning to fusion. And rigidity is not strength. It's defensive differentiation. The real work begins here. Jung described individuation not as separation from others, but as the ability to stand as a differentiated self, while remaining in relationship. That means something very specific. You no longer organize yourself around someone else's emotional field, but you also don't withdraw from what is. You learn to sit in tension, without rushing to resolve it. You allow others to experience the weight of their own emotional field, without absorbing it, and you stay present, not corrective, not superior, present. This is subtle work, because the old reflex was to merge, and the new temptation is to detach. Integration is neither. Integration is staying. Staying without dissolving. Staying without rescuing. Staying without armoring. That requires internal stability, not performance. You will still feel the undercurrents. You will still notice the inconsistencies. You will still detect the unspoken dynamics. But instead of translating them or rejecting them, you hold your own center. This is what Jung meant when he spoke about strengthening the ego in service of the self. Not ego as dominance. Ego as structure. Without structure, perception overwhelms. With structure, perception informs. And when perception informs rather than controls, clarity becomes grounded. You don't need to convince anyone of what you see. You don't need to expose it. You don't need to correct it. You simply remain congruent. And congruence is stabilizing. Ironically, the more internally stable you become, the less threatening your clarity feels to others. Not because you hide it, but because it's no longer charged. Projection decreases when you're not unconsciously reacting to it. You stop needing to be right. You stop needing to be recognized as perceptive. You stop identifying with the role of the one who sees. And that is a profound shift. Because identity built around perception is still identity. And individuation dissolves identities. It doesn't replace one mask with another. It removes the need for one. So after the Sophia stage, the real question is not, why don't I belong anymore? It becomes, what kind of belonging is possible now? And the answer is quieter than you expect. Belonging after differentiation feels different. It's slower, less performative, more selective. You no longer connect through emotional overextension. You connect through resonance. And resonance is rare, but it is real. You start noticing something unexpected. When you stop trying to be understood by everyone, a few people begin understanding you naturally. Not because you explained more, because you are more coherent. Jung wrote that the individuated person recognizes another individuated person immediately. There is a quality of presence, a solidity, an absence of performance. These connections don't feel dramatic. They feel relieving. No need to translate. No need to soften. No need to armor. Just mutual awareness. And that awareness feels stabilizing instead of destabilizing. The Sophia stage was not meant to isolate you. It was meant to refine you, so that what remains is deliberate connection. You may have fewer conversations, but they are deeper. You may have fewer relationships, but they are cleaner. You may speak less, but when you speak, it is aligned. This is not detachment from humanity. It is alignment within it. The illusion dissolves, but connection does not. It transforms. After the Sophia stage, clarity does have a cost. And this is what you do when you can't ignore it anymore. But the cost is not exile. It's the loss of unconscious belonging. It's the moment you realize you cannot unknow what you know. You cannot remerge without shrinking. You cannot pretend not to see without fragmenting. And that realization changes you permanently. Some people will drift. Some will project. Some will become uneasy in your presence. But the real transformation is quieter than all of that. You stop negotiating with your own perception. You stop asking permission to trust what you see. You stop collapsing your awareness to preserve comfort. And something stabilizes. Not loudly. Internally. Jung never described individuation as a path toward isolation. He described it as the path toward wholeness. Wholeness is not fusion. Wholeness is structure. Structure allows openness without dissolution. Structure allows compassion without overfunctioning. Structure allows connection without self-erasure. You are not losing your place in the world. You are losing your place in unconscious dynamics. And that feels like distance before it feels like alignment. There will be a period where you feel slightly ahead of the rhythm. Not superior. Not detached. Just early. Early to see. Early to withdraw from illusion. Early to stop carrying what was never yours. But eventually, you begin to notice something. The world doesn't become smaller. It becomes clearer. And clarity, when integrated, is not cold. It is calm. The Sophia stage was never about becoming untouchable. It was about becoming unmergeable. There is a difference. Untouchable is defensive. Unmergeable is differentiated. And differentiation is the beginning of real intimacy. Because the only connection that survives this stage is the one that does not require you to disappear. If you feel slightly out of rhythm now, it may not be because you lost belonging. It may be because you are no longer negotiating your own consciousness. And that is not the end of connection. It is the end of belonging through self-erasure. The danger was never that you see too much. The danger was that you might return to blindness just to feel included. And you didn't.